pungent odor of horse manure, tobacco, and whiskey hung heavy in the dusty air as Vivian Blakely watched the last wagon of the caravan disappear over the horizon. Her heart sank into the pit of her stomach. The Warren family had left her behind at Stillwater Trading Post, a ramshackle collection of buildings in the heart of Wyoming Territory, 1876. 22 years old, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small carpet bag containing her meager possessions, Vivian fought back tears as the reality of her situation became painfully clear. "Miss, you all right there?" A deep voice startled her from behind. Vivian turned to see a tall man leaning against the porch post of the trading post. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline peppered with stubble and eyes that reminded her of a summer sky. He wore dusty denims, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing tanned forearms, and a leather vest that had seen better days. They left me," Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Warrens. I was traveling with them to Oregon, working as a governess for their children." She swallowed hard, fighting the quiver in her voice. "Mrs. Warren accused me of impropriety with her husband, but I swear, I never—" "No need to explain yourself to me, miss," the man said, pushing away from the post and walking toward her. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat fields in late summer. "Xavier Prescott. Most folks call me Zav." "Vivian Blakely," she replied, clutching her carpet bag tighter against her chest like a shield. "Well, Miss Blakely," Xavier said, his eyes scanning the horizon where the wagon train had disappeared. "Seems to me you're in a bit of a predicament." Vivian nodded, a single tear finally breaking free and sliding down her cheek. "I don't know what to do. I have a little money, but not enough for passage to Oregon, and I don't know a soul in these parts." Xavier studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. The wind picked up, sending a swirl of dust between them and causing Vivian to tuck a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "I'm heading back to my ranch tomorrow morning. It's about 3 days' ride south of here," he finally said. "I could use some help around the place. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, isn't getting any younger, and she's been complaining about needing an extra pair of hands." Vivian eyed him warily. She had learned the hard way that a woman alone had to be careful of men's offers, especially in these wild territories. Reading her expression, Xavier raised his hands. "It's an honest offer, Miss Blakely. You'd have your own room in the main house, fair wages, and Mrs. Abernathy would be proper chaperone. When you've saved enough, I'll personally see you get passage wherever you want to go." "Why would you help me? You don't know me," Vivian said, suspicion evident in her voice. Xavier placed his hat back on his head and adjusted it slightly. "My ma taught me to never turn my back on someone in need. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "Mrs. Abernathy really would appreciate the help." Inside the trading post, the owner, a gruff man named Henry Thompson, had been watching their exchange through the window. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "The Prescott Ranch is a respectable place, miss," he offered. "Xavier here is one of the most honorable men in the territory. If he's offering you work, you'd be wise to take it." Vivian glanced between the two men, weighing her options. She had very few, if she was being honest with herself. The thought of being stranded at this trading post, with night approaching, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. "I'll take you home where you belong," Xavier said softly. "Even if that's just until you figure out where that is." Something in his words, or perhaps the gentle way he said them, broke through Vivian's hesitation. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Thank you. Mr. Prescott, I accept your offer." "Good," he replied with a nod. "We'll leave at first light. Henry here can give you a place to sleep tonight." He turned to the trading post owner. "Put it on my tab, Henry." "Already planned to, Zav," Henry replied with a nod. That night, in a small but clean room above the trading post, Vivian lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day played through her mind on an endless loop. Just that morning, she had awakened in the Warrens' wagon, ready for another day of travel. By midday, Mrs. Warren had been screaming accusations at her, and by sunset, she found herself accepting help from a stranger. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Vivian wondered what awaited her at the Prescott Ranch. She had no idea that the dusty cowboy who had offered her salvation would change the course of her life forever. Dawn broke with a brilliant orange glow over the eastern horizon. Xavier was already loading supplies onto his pack horse when Vivian emerged from the trading post. She had changed into her only other dress, a simple blue cotton garment that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable. "Morning, Miss Blakely," Xavier greeted, tipping his hat. "Sleep well?" "As well as could be expected, thank you," she replied. She had pinned her hair up neatly and washed her face, but Xavier couldn't help but notice the dark circles under her eyes. "Henry's wife packed some biscuits and dried beef for the journey," he said, gesturing to a package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not fancy, but it'll keep us going." Vivian nodded, clutching her carpet bag. "Mr. Prescott, I want to thank you again for your kindness. I promise I won't be a burden." Xavier's expression softened. "No need for thanks. And please, call me Xavier or Zav. Mr. Prescott was my father." He helped her mount a gentle-looking mare with a chestnut coat. "This here's Penny. She's even-tempered and sure-footed. She'll treat you right if you do the same for her." Vivian tentatively stroked the horse's neck, earning a soft nicker in response. It had been years since she'd ridden, not since she was a girl in Boston before her parents died of influenza, leaving her to fend for herself. "I haven't ridden in some time," she admitted. "Penny will remember for you," Xavier assured her with a small smile. He mounted his own horse, a powerful black stallion that stood several hands taller than Penny. They set off, as the sun cleared the horizon, heading south from the trading post. Xavier led the way with Vivian following, and the pack horse tied behind them. The vastness of the Wyoming landscape stretched before them, rolling hills covered in sagebrush, distant mountains with snow-capped peaks, and a sky so wide and blue it seemed infinite. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Vivian was lost in her thoughts, still processing the dramatic turn her life had taken, while Xavier seemed content with the quiet. Finally, as they forded a shallow creek, Vivian's curiosity got the better of her. "Have you lived in Wyoming Territory long, Mr. Xavier?" He glanced back at her. "All my life. My father came west during the gold rush of '49, but he was smarter than most. Instead of panning for gold, he bought land. Started with 100 acres and built it up to nearly 2,000 before he passed." "I'm sorry about your father," Vivian said softly. Xavier nodded his acknowledgement. "Been 5 years now. My mother joined him last winter." "You're alone at the ranch then, except for Mrs. Abernathy, I mean." "Not exactly. Got about 10 ranch hands who help with the cattle. My foreman, Eli Cooper, has been with us since before I was born. There's Doc, who handles most of the veterinary needs. Then there's Mrs. Abernathy's husband, Jacob, who helps with the maintenance of the buildings." He paused, then added, "My younger sister, Rose, lives in town with her husband, the local doctor. They visit when they can." They rode on, the rhythm of the horse's hooves creating a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Xavier explained that his ranch primarily raised cattle, though they kept some horses as well. They sold beef to nearby towns and to the railroad companies, feeding their workers as they pushed the tracks westward. "What about you, Miss Blakely? What brought you out west with the Warrens?" Xavier asked as they stopped around midday to rest the horses and eat some of the provisions. Vivian sighed, settling onto a flat rock in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. "After my parents died, I worked as a seamstress in Boston for several years. The work was steady, but the pay poor, and the conditions in the factory were difficult." She accepted the water canteen Xavier offered her. "When I saw an advertisement in the newspaper seeking a governess for a family heading to Oregon, it seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start." "How long were you with them before?" Xavier trailed off, not wanting to bring up painful memories. "Nearly 2 months, Vivian replied, her gaze distant. The children were sweet 2 boys, ages 8 and 10. Mr. Warren was always professional, despite what his wife claimed. Mrs. Warren, however, she sighed. She was suspicious from the start. I think she was unhappy about leaving Boston and took her frustrations out on me. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Some folks can't handle the challenges of the frontier. They look for someone to blame when things get hard. Perhaps, Vivian agreed. Or perhaps she simply saw a younger woman as a threat, regardless of whether one existed. They finished their meal in companionable silence before continuing their journey. As the day wore on, Vivian found herself relaxing in Xavier's company. Despite her initial wariness, there was something reassuring about his calm, steady presence. By late afternoon, her muscles were screaming in protest from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Xavier must have noticed her discomfort, for he soon led them to a small grove of trees near a bubbling stream. "We'll make camp here for the night," he announced, dismounting with easy grace. "There's good water for the horses and shelter if the weather turns." Vivian tried to dismount with similar dignity, but found her legs had stiffened considerably. Xavier stepped forward, offering a steadying hand. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "First day is always the hardest," he said kindly. "By the time we reach the ranch, you'll have found your riding legs again." Xavier efficiently set up a small camp, building a fire and preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee. Vivian insisted on helping, though her domestic skills were limited to sewing and basic cooking. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to properly set up camp," Xavier said as they sat by the fire, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "It's a skill every person in these territories should have." Vivian nodded, grateful for his patience. "I'm afraid I'm not very useful out here. In Boston, knowing which fork to use at dinner or how to embroider a handkerchief were considered essential skills for a lady." Xavier's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Not much call for fancy embroidery on the ranch, but I reckon Mrs. Abernathy might appreciate someone who knows about such things. She's always talking about bringing some civilization to our rough ways." As night fell completely, Xavier set up 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. "I'll take first watch," he said, checking his rifle before settling against a tree trunk. "Get some rest, Miss Blakely." "Vivian," she said impulsively. "Please, if I'm to call you Xavier, then you must call me Vivian." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Vivian it is. Sleep well." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Vivian for some time. She lay staring up at the star-filled sky, marveling at how many more stars were visible here than in Boston. Occasionally, she glanced across the fire to where Xavier sat, his profile illuminated by the flickering flames. She wondered about this quiet, thoughtful man who had so readily offered help to a complete stranger. Eventually, the rhythmic sounds of the night crickets chirping, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional soft whinny from the horses lulled her to sleep. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. They rode from dawn until dusk, stopping only to rest the horses and eat quick meals. Xavier proved to be a patient teacher, showing Vivian how to read the land, identify edible plants, and care for the horses. In return, Vivian shared stories of life in Boston, describing the bustling streets, grand buildings, and cultural events that were so different from life on the frontier. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, Vivian had grown more comfortable in the saddle and with Xavier's company. They had developed an easy rapport, finding common ground in their love of books. Xavier had a surprising collection inherited from his mother, and their mutual respect for the breathtaking landscape around them. "Just over that ridge," Xavier said, pointing to a low hill ahead, "you'll get your first look at the Prescott Ranch." Vivian felt a flutter of nervous anticipation as they crested the hill. The valley below opened up before them, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled against a backdrop of distant mountains. A large 2-story house stood as the centerpiece, surrounded by various outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, corrals, and what appeared to be workshops. Fields of hay stretched to the east, while cattle dotted the pastures to the west. A stream wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. It's beautiful, Vivian breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Home, Xavier said simply, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. As they rode down toward the ranch, a plump woman in her 60s emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her round face broke into a warm smile as she spotted them. "Mrs. Abernathy," Xavier called out as they approached, "I've brought you some help." The older woman shaded her eyes against the late afternoon sun, assessing Vivian with frank curiosity. "About time you started bringing home something prettier than cattle, Xavier Prescott," she called back, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. Xavier dismounted and helped Vivian down from Penny. After 3 days in the saddle, her legs trembled beneath her, but she managed to stand straight as Xavier made the introductions. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Vivian Blakely. She'll be helping around the house for a while. Vivian, this is Mrs. Margaret Abernathy, the backbone of Prescott Ranch and the best cook in the territory." Mrs. Abernathy's handshake was firm and warm. "Welcome to our home, Miss Blakely. You look like you could use a hot bath and a proper meal. Come along inside and we'll get you settled." With a grateful nod to Xavier, Vivian followed Mrs. Abernathy into the house, stepping into a large, welcoming kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. The older woman bustled about, putting on a kettle and pulling out a chair at the sturdy oak table. "Sit, child. You must be exhausted after riding with that man for 3 days. Did he talk your ear off?" "No, of course not. That boy's always been stingy with his words." She chattered on, not really expecting answers as she prepared tea and set out slices of freshly baked bread with butter and honey. Vivian sank gratefully into the chair, the comforting domesticity of the kitchen washing over her like a balm. For the first time since being abandoned at the trading post, she felt a sense of security. After a reviving cup of tea and some bread, Mrs. Abernathy showed Vivian to a room on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. "This will be your space," she said, opening the door to reveal a modest but comfortable bedroom. A single bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, a small dresser and washstand against another. A rocking chair sat in the corner near a window that overlooked the mountains to the west. "It's lovely," Vivian said sincerely, placing her carpet bag on the bed. "The bathroom's down the hall. Xavier's father put in indoor plumbing 2 years before he passed." "Man was ahead of his time," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "I'll bring up some hot water for your bath. Dinner's at 6 sharp. Xavier and the men eat in the main dining room." After the older woman left, Vivian sank onto the bed, running her hands over the colorful quilt. After months of sleeping in wagons, tents, and under the stars, the prospect of a real bed in a real room felt like unimaginable luxury. True to her word, Mrs. Abernathy soon returned with help, a young ranch hand carrying buckets of hot water for the bath. Once it was prepared, Vivian gratefully sank into the steaming water, washing away the dust and fatigue of the journey. She washed her hair, too, and changed into her last clean dress, a simple gray garment that had seen better days but would have to do until she could wash her others. At dinner, Vivian met more of the ranch's inhabitants. Eli Cooper, the foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Jacob Abernathy was tall and thin, with hands calloused from years of carpentry and maintenance work. 3 of the ranch hands also joined them. Tom, a red-headed young man barely out of his teens. Hank, a middle-aged former soldier with a quiet demeanor. And Freddie, a jovial man with a thick mustache who kept the table entertained with stories of his adventures. Throughout the meal, Vivian was aware of Xavier's presence at the head of the table. He spoke little, letting his men carry the conversation, but his eyes often drifted to her, checking that she was comfortable among this rough but good-natured group. After dinner, as the men drifted off to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Abernathy began clearing away dishes, Xavier approached Vivian. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his voice low. "Very well, thank you," she replied. "Everyone has been most welcoming." He nodded, seeming pleased. "Tomorrow Mrs. Abernathy will show you your duties. Don't let her work you too hard your first day." I'm not afraid of hard work, Xavier, Vivian said with a small smile. No, I don't suppose you are. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he cleared his throat. Well, good night then. Vivian. Good night. As she climbed the stairs to her room later, Vivian found herself pondering the complexities of Xavier Prescott. He was not what she had initially expected from a frontier rancher. There was a gentleness to him, a thoughtfulness that seemed at odds with the rugged life he led. Yet he clearly commanded the respect of his men and ran a successful operation. That night, as she lay in the comfortable bed with moonlight streaming through her window, Vivian thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place. Being abandoned at that trading post had seemed like the worst possible outcome, but now, safe in this house with the promise of honest work, she wondered if perhaps it had been a blessing in disguise. The following weeks fell into a steady routine. Mrs. Abernathy proved to be a kind but exacting taskmaster, teaching Vivian the ins and outs of managing a large household on the frontier. Vivian's days were filled with cooking, cleaning, mending, and occasionally helping in the vegetable garden that supplied much of the ranch's produce. To her surprise, Vivian found she enjoyed the work. There was a satisfaction in seeing immediate results of her labor, freshly baked bread cooling on the rack, newly washed linens snapping on the line, or a torn shirt made whole again under her skilled needle. It was different from the monotonous factory work in Boston, where she had been just one pair of hands among many, producing goods she would never see used. Xavier was often away from the house during daylight hours, riding out with his men to check on cattle, mend fences, or handle the myriad tasks required to keep the ranch running smoothly. But he was always present at dinner, listening more than speaking as his workers discussed the day's events. Sometimes in the evenings, Vivian would find him in the small library off the main parlor, reading by lamplight. On one such evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Vivian paused in the doorway, a stack of mended shirts in her arms. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said when Xavier looked up from his book. "You're not disturbing me," he replied, marking his place with a ribbon. "Come in if you'd like." Vivian hesitated, then stepped into the room. It was cozy, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 2 walls, a comfortable-looking leather chair where Xavier sat, and a smaller wingback chair near the window. "What are you reading?" she asked, setting the shirts on a small table. Xavier held up the book The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. "Have you read it?" he asked. Vivian nodded. "Yes, though it's been several years. My father had a copy in his study. He loved adventure stories." "As do I," Xavier admitted, "though this one doesn't quite capture the reality of frontier life." "Few books do, I imagine," Vivian said, running her fingers along the spines of nearby volumes. "Your collection is impressive." "My mother's influence," Xavier explained. "She was educated back East Philadelphia. When she married my father and came west with him, she insisted on bringing as many books as they could carry. She added to the collection whenever possible." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. A shadow crossed Xavier's face, and Vivian remembered that he had lost his mother only the previous winter. "I should let you get back to your reading," she said softly, turning to leave. "Vivian," Xavier called after her. When she paused, he added, "Feel free to borrow any book that interests you. They're meant to be read, not just admired on shelves." She smiled, genuinely touched by the offer. "Thank you. I'd like that very much." From that night on, Vivian often found herself in the library after her duties were complete, sometimes reading quietly while Xavier did the same, other times engaging in discussions about the books they had both enjoyed. These conversations gradually expanded to include their backgrounds, their hopes, and their views on the changing world around them. Vivian learned that Xavier had attended college in Denver for 2 years, before his father's illness called him home to the ranch. He had a keen mind and progressive ideas about ranching methods, water conservation, and fair treatment of workers that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. In turn, she shared more about her life in Boston, her childhood in a modest but comfortable home. Her parents' emphasis on education, even for their daughter, and the harsh realities she faced after their deaths when distant relatives claimed their property and left her to fend for herself. "You've shown remarkable resilience," Xavier commented one evening as they sat in the library, a summer thunderstorm raging outside. Many would have been broken by such experiences. Vivian looked up from her book, studying his face in the warm lamplight. "I'm not sure resilience is the right word. Survival, perhaps. You do what you must. And yet here you are, making a new life for yourself thousands of miles from where you began." She smiled wryly. "Not entirely by choice, if you recall." "No," he agreed, "but you've embraced it nonetheless. Mrs. Abernathy says you're a natural at household management. She's already wondering how we managed without you." A pleased flush warmed Vivian's cheeks at the compliment. "Mrs. Abernathy is too kind. I still have much to learn about frontier living." "We all do in some way or another," Xavier replied thoughtfully. Their eyes met across the room, and Vivian felt a curious fluttering in her chest. There was something in Xavier's gaze, a warmth, an admiration perhaps, that made her both nervous and exhilarated. She quickly looked away, returning her attention to her book, though the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. Summer progressed into early autumn, bringing with it the cattle roundup, a busy time at the ranch when all hands were needed to gather, sort, and drive the cattle that would be sold at market. Even Mrs. Abernathy and Vivian found themselves helping more directly with ranch operations, preparing massive amounts of food to keep the hard-working men fed, and occasionally riding out to deliver meals to those working far afield. It was during one such delivery that Vivian's life at the ranch took an unexpected turn. She had ridden out alone on Penny, carrying saddlebags filled with food for Xavier and 3 of his men who were working a distant section of the property. The day was clear but cool. A perfect September afternoon with golden light slanting across the landscape. Vivian had grown confident in her riding abilities over the past months, and she enjoyed the solitude of the ride, taking in the beauty of the ranch lands. She found Xavier and his men working to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a falling tree. "Miss Blakely," Eli called out when he spotted her, "tell me you've brought some of Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie." Vivian smiled as she dismounted. "2 whole pies, Mr. Cooper, but you'll have to share." The men gathered eagerly around as she unpacked the food-cold chicken, biscuits, apples, and the promised pies. They ate with enthusiasm, sitting in the shade of a large oak tree. Xavier sat slightly apart from the others, and after a moment's hesitation, Vivian joined him, bringing him a plate of food. "Thank you," he said, accepting it with a nod. "Did you ride out here alone?" "Yes," she replied, sensing his concern. Mrs. Abernathy had her hands full with preparations for dinner, and Jacob was fixing a leak in the roof. Xavier frowned slightly. "Next time, ask one of the hands to accompany you. The land can be treacherous even when you think you know it." "I've become quite proficient with Penny," Vivian pointed out, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "And I stayed on the main trails." "Even so," Xavier insisted, "it's not just about your riding abilities. There are other dangers: rattlesnakes, the occasional mountain lion, even unsavory characters passing through." Vivian wanted to argue further, but decided against it. Xavier was responsible for everyone on his ranch, after all. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll be more cautious in the future." They ate in silence for a few minutes, watching as the ranch hands joked and laughed among themselves. "The cattle drive begins next week," Xavier said eventually. "I'll be gone for about 10 days. Vivian looked at him in surprise. This was the first she had heard of his extended absence. "I see. Is that usual for the ranch owner to go on the drive?" "My father always did, and I've continued the tradition. I like to see the process through from beginning to end." He paused, then added, "Eli will remain behind to oversee things at the ranch." Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the odd sense of disappointment that washed over her at the thought of Xavier's absence. "I'm sure everything will run smoothly while you're away. Xavier studied her face for a moment. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Vivian." "Yes? Have you given any more thought to your plans? You mentioned wanting to continue to Oregon eventually." The question caught her off guard. In truth, she had thought less and less about leaving as the weeks passed. The ranch had begun to feel like home, and the people there, especially Xavier, like family. I suppose I haven't considered it much lately," she admitted. "I've been focused on learning my duties here." "You've more than earned your passage money by now," Xavier said quietly. "If Oregon is still your destination, I could arrange for you to join a wagon train heading west after the harvest is in." Vivian felt a sudden hollowness in her chest. Is this your way of suggesting it's time for me to move on?" Xavier's eyes widened. "No, not at all. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from the usually composed rancher. "I don't want you to feel obligated to stay if you have other dreams to pursue." Relief flooded through her. "I'm not ready to leave yet," she said softly, "if that's all right with you." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, relief perhaps, or pleasure. "More than all right. You've become an important part of the ranch, Vivian. Mrs. Abernathy would never forgive me if I let you go." Just Mrs. Abernathy, Vivian wondered, but kept the thought to herself. Their conversation was interrupted by Eli announcing it was time to get back to work. Vivian packed up the remaining food, preparing to return to the main house. As she mounted Penny, Xavier approached, resting a hand on the horse's neck. "Remember what I said about riding alone," he reminded her. "I will," she promised. Then, impulsively, she added, "Be careful on the cattle drive, Xavier." He looked up at her, his blue eyes warm in the afternoon sun. "I always am." Vivian rode back to the ranch house with her thoughts in turmoil. Over the past months, her feelings for Xavier had evolved from gratitude to friendship to something more complex. She admired his quiet strength, his intelligence, his compassion. She looked forward to their evening conversations in the library, to catching glimpses of him working around the ranch, to the way his presence at the dinner table made the room feel complete. But was she mistaking ordinary kindness for deeper affection? Xavier had offered her a job and shelter when she needed it most, but that didn't mean he saw her as anything more than an employee or perhaps a friend. And even if he did harbor warmer feelings, was she ready for such attachment? Her experience with the Warrens had taught her the precarious position of a single woman dependent on others' goodwill. These thoughts occupied Vivian's mind throughout the following week as preparations for the cattle drive intensified. The ranch buzzed with activity. Provisions were packed, horses were shod, cattle were gathered from the far reaches of the property. Vivian threw herself into helping, assisting Mrs. Abernathy with food preparation, mending clothing for the men, and even helping Jacob check the gear and wagons. The night before the drive was to begin, a farewell dinner was held in the main house. The atmosphere was boisterous, with the men excited for the journey ahead despite the hard work it would entail. Stories and jokes flowed freely, along with Mrs. Abernathy's excellent food. Xavier, however, seemed subdued. He participated in the conversations when directly addressed, but otherwise remained quiet, his gaze occasionally finding Vivian across the table. After dinner, as the men drifted outside to make final preparations for the early morning departure, Vivian found herself alone in the kitchen with Xavier. She was wiping down the long wooden table when he entered, carrying a stack of plates. "You don't need to help with that," she said, surprised. "I know," he replied simply, setting the dishes in the wash basin. They worked in silence for a few moments, Vivian increasingly aware of his presence just a few feet away. "I'll miss our evenings in the library," Xavier said finally, his voice low. Vivian's heart skipped a beat. "As will I," she admitted, keeping her eyes on her task. "Vivian." Something in his tone made her look up. Xavier had moved closer, standing just an arm's length away. "I want you to know that what I said before about helping you get to Oregon, it wasn't because I want you to leave. Quite the opposite, in fact." She stared at him, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning. What do you mean? Xavier took a deep breath. I mean that these past months with you here have been different, better. You've brought something to this house, to this ranch to me that I didn't even realize was missing. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Xavier, I'm not asking anything of you, he hurried to add. I just wanted you to know before I leave tomorrow, in case... He didn't finish the thought, but Vivian knew what remained unsaid. Cattle drives could be dangerous. Men didn't always return. Without allowing herself time to think better of it, Vivian stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. I'll be here when you get back, she said softly. We can talk more then. Xavier covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. For a long moment they stood like that, the unspoken growing between them like a living thing. Then the back door banged open as Freddie entered, breaking the spell. Boss, we need you out at the corral. One of the new horses is giving Tom trouble, he announced, seemingly oblivious to the moment he had interrupted. Xavier reluctantly stepped back. I'll be right there. As Freddie left, Xavier turned back to Vivian. Remember what I said? She nodded, unable to trust her voice. After he left, she leaned against the table, her heart racing. In just a few simple words, Xavier had confirmed what she had barely allowed herself to hope, that he felt the same connection she did. The next morning, Vivian rose before dawn to see the cattle drive off. The yard was chaotic with men, horses, and dogs preparing for departure. Xavier was in the thick of it, giving last-minute instructions to those staying behind and checking that everything was in order for the journey. As the men began to mount up, Xavier sought Vivian out where she stood on the porch with Mrs. Abernathy. He approached, looking handsome and capable in his riding clothes, his hat pulled low against the pre-dawn chill. Take care of my home while I'm gone, he said, his eyes conveying far more than his words. We will, Vivian promised. Be safe, Xavier. He nodded, held her gaze for one more moment, then turned and mounted his horse. With a series of whistles and calls, the men began moving the cattle, and soon the entire herd was heading out, a cloud of dust rising in the early morning light. Vivian watched until they disappeared from sight, a curious mixture of hope and anxiety swirling within her. 10 days suddenly seemed like an eternity. Life at the ranch settled into a different rhythm with the men gone. The remaining ranch hands focused on harvesting the last of the vegetable garden, preparing the buildings for the coming winter, and tending to the horses and other livestock left behind. Vivian continued her household duties, but found her thoughts constantly drifting to Xavier and the cattle drive, wondering where they were and if they were safe. On the 4th night after their departure, a violent storm blew in from the mountains. Wind howled around the eaves of the house, rain lashed against the windows, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts followed by booming thunder. Vivian sat in the library, unable to concentrate on her book as she worried about Xavier and his men caught out in such weather. Mrs. Abernathy brought her a cup of tea, her own face lined with concern. They'll have found shelter, the older woman assured her, patting Vivian's shoulder. Xavier knows that country better than anyone. He won't take unnecessary risks. Vivian nodded, trying to take comfort in the words. I just can't help thinking of them out there in this. Mrs. Abernathy studied her face for a moment, then sat down in Xavier's chair with a small grunt. You care for him, don't you? More than as just your employer? Vivian flushed, but there seemed little point in denial. Yes, she admitted, though I'm not certain what that means for my future here. The older woman smiled knowingly. I've worked for the Prescott family for 30 years, child. I helped raise that boy after his mother brought him into this world, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Really? Vivian asked, hope rising in her chest. Really? That boy's always been careful with his heart. After losing both parents so close together, he closed himself off a bit. Focused on the ranch to the exclusion of everything else. She leaned forward. Until you arrived. Vivian didn't know how to respond. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, a different kind of turbulence was settling into a strange calm. What happened with the Warrens being abandoned at that trading post? It seemed like the worst thing that could have happened to me, she said slowly. But now I wonder if it wasn't fate stepping in. Mrs. Abernathy nodded sagely. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Sometimes the darkest moments lead us exactly where we need to be. The days continued to pass, each one bringing the cattle drive's return closer. On the morning of the 10th day, Vivian found herself watching the horizon more often than attending to her duties, earning knowing smiles from Mrs. Abernathy. But the day passed with no sign of the returning men. Then another day and another. By the 13th day, anxiety had settled like a rock in Vivian's stomach. Should we be worried? She asked Eli, who had ridden out to check the southern boundary of the property. The foreman shook his head. Cattle drives rarely keep to schedule. Could be they got delayed crossing the river if it was running high after that storm. Or maybe they got a good price and decided to sell more cattle than originally planned, which would take extra time to sort out. Vivian nodded, trying to accept his reasonable explanations. Still, that night she slept poorly, plagued by dreams of Xavier injured or lost. It was mid-afternoon of the 14th day when the lookout they'd posted spotted the returning party. Vivian was in the garden harvesting late tomatoes when she heard the shout. "Riders coming! It's them!" She dropped her basket and ran to the front of the house, shading her eyes against the sun as she peered down the road. Sure enough, a group of riders was approaching, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Even at this distance, she could make out Xavier's tall form at the head of the group. Relief swept through her so powerfully that her knees felt weak. She pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking back unexpected tears as she watched them draw closer. The men rode into the yard with shouts and laughter, clearly in high spirits. As they dismounted, Vivian could hear snippets of conversation about a successful drive and good prices at market. Xavier swung down from his horse and was immediately surrounded by ranch hands asking questions and welcoming him home. Vivian stayed on the porch, suddenly unsure of herself. What if their conversation before he left had been misinterpreted? What if, in the excitement of the drive's success, he had forgotten his words to her? Then Xavier looked up and saw her standing there. Even across the yard she could see his face brighten. He said something to Eli, handed his reins to Tom, and began walking toward her with purposeful strides. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs as he climbed the porch steps, stopping just in front of her. He looked trail-worn, dusty, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "You're back," she said, the words inadequate but all she could manage. "I am," he replied, removing his hat. "Sorry we're late. The river was high after that storm." "I was worried," she admitted. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Were you?" "Yes." Xavier glanced over his shoulder at the busy yard, then back to Vivian. "I'd like to talk with you, but I should see to the men and hear reports from Eli first. Will you meet me in the library after dinner?" Vivian nodded, trying to keep her expression composed despite the anticipation fluttering in her chest. "Of course." Dinner that night was a jubilant affair, with the men recounting tales from the drive, difficulties overcome, humorous incidents, the haggling at market. Xavier confirmed that the prices had indeed been excellent, promising bonuses for everyone. Throughout the meal, Vivian was acutely aware of Xavier at the head of the table. Their eyes met several times, sending currents of electricity through her that made it difficult to focus on her food or the conversations around her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the dinner concluded. The men, exhausted from their journey and full of good food, headed to the bunkhouse while Mrs. Abernathy shooed Vivian away from helping with the dishes. "Go on," she whispered with a meaningful glance toward the library. "Some things are more important than clean dishes." With a grateful smile, Vivian made her way to the library. Xavier wasn't there yet, so she moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The night was clear and cool, with a bright moon casting silver light over the ranch yard. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. then the sound of the door closing softly. Vivian turned to find Xavier standing just inside the room, freshly shaved and changed into clean clothes. "The cattle drive was successful," she said, for lack of anything better to begin with. "Very," he agreed, moving further into the room. "But that's not what I wanted to discuss with you." Vivian took a steadying breath. "What did you want to discuss?" Xavier came to stand before her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and the faint aroma of coffee that always seemed to cling to him. "Before I left, I told you that you had brought something to this ranch to me that I didn't realize was missing," he began, his voice low and earnest. "During those days on the trail, with nothing but time to think, I realized exactly what that something is." Vivian held her breath, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. "What is it?" "Life," Xavier said simply. "Real life, beyond just work and duty and responsibility. You brought laughter back to this house, conversation, warmth." He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I rode out of here 2 weeks ago uncertain of many things, but I came back certain of one. I don't want you to leave, Vivian. Not for Oregon, not for anywhere." Vivian's heart soared at his words, but caution made her hesitate. "As your housekeeper, you mean?" Xavier shook his head, a smile touching his lips. "No, though I'm sure Mrs. Abernathy would be thrilled to keep you in that capacity." He took a step closer. "I want you to stay as more than that, much more." "Xavier," Vivian whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I know it hasn't been long," he continued. "Just a few months since I found you at that trading post. Maybe this is too soon, too fast. But out there on the trail, facing that storm, all I could think about was getting back to you. And I realized I don't want to waste any more time." Vivian looked up into his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the hope and vulnerability there. In that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed insignificant compared to the truth of what she felt for this man. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Not when you feel as I do." Xavier's expression lightened, hope replacing uncertainty. And how is that?" "That somehow, in the space of a few months, you've become the most important person in my life," Vivian admitted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "That being left behind at that trading post was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it led me here. To you." Xavier's smile widened, and he raised his free hand to gently touch her cheek. "When I saw you standing there, looking so lost and alone, I told you I'd take you home where you belong," he said. "I didn't realize then that your belonging here would mean so much to me." "I do belong here," Vivian agreed. "With you." Xavier leaned down, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Vivian had no desire to retreat. She lifted her face to his, and their lips met in a tender kiss that seemed to seal the promises they'd just made. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and she reached up to rest her hands on his shoulders, reveling in the solid strength of him. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Vivian Blakely. I think I started falling in love with you somewhere between Stillwater Trading Post and here, watching you find your courage and strength with each passing day." Tears of joy pricked at Vivian's eyes. "I love you too, Xavier Prescott, more than I thought possible." Xavier kissed her again, more deeply this time, his arms tightening around her as if he never wanted to let go. Vivian responded with equal fervor, all the emotions she'd been holding in check finally finding release. A discreet cough from the doorway made them spring apart. Mrs. Abernathy stood there, a knowing smile on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, not looking sorry at all. "But Jacob was asking about tomorrow's work assignments, Xavier." "Tell him I'll speak with him in the morning." "Mrs. Abernathy," Xavier replied, his eyes never leaving Vivian's face. The housekeeper nodded, her smile widening. "I'll do that." As she turned to go, she added, "About time, if you ask me. Been watching you two dance around each other for months." After she left, Xavier and Vivian looked at each other and burst into laughter. "I suppose we weren't as subtle as we thought," Vivian said, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and happiness. "Apparently not," Xavier agreed, "but I can't bring myself to care." He took her hands in his. "Vivian, I know this is sudden, but I need to ask, would you consider making this arrangement permanent, becoming my wife?" Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Despite the intensity of their feelings, she hadn't expected a proposal so soon. "Xavier, are you certain?" "I have nothing to bring to a marriage, no dowry, no family connections." "I don't want or need those things," he interrupted gently. "All I want is you, your strength, your kindness, your spirit. We can wait if you prefer, court properly for a time, but I know what I feel, and it won't change whether we marry tomorrow or a year from now." Vivian considered his words. She had learned through hard experience to be cautious, to protect herself. But she had also learned to recognize sincerity when she saw it, and everything about Xavier Prescott spoke of honesty and integrity. "Yes," she said finally, her heart full to bursting. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier." His face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into another embrace, lifting her feet off the ground in his enthusiasm. When he set her down, he kissed her again, sealing their promise to one another. "We should wait until spring," Vivian said, practical even in her happiness. "It would give us time to plan, and the weather would be better for guests to travel." Xavier nodded. "Spring it is, though it will be a long winter of waiting." "A winter of planning and preparation," Vivian corrected with a smile, "and we'll have each other's company throughout." That night, as Vivian prepared for bed, she stood at her window looking out at the moonlit landscape of what would soon be her home in every sense. From the tragic mistake that had left her stranded at a trading post had come the greatest blessing of her life. Xavier had promised to take her home where she belonged, and he had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. The months leading up to their spring wedding passed in a blur of activity and happiness. Word spread quickly throughout the territory about the upcoming nuptials of Xavier Prescott and his trading post bride, as some teasingly called Vivian. Xavier's sister Rose and her husband were delighted with the news, with Rose immediately appointing herself chief wedding planner. Vivian continued her duties at the ranch, though Mrs. Abernathy insisted on treating her more as the future mistress of the house than as help. Together, they began planning the changes that would come with Vivian's new role, redecorating the master bedroom that had remained largely untouched since Xavier's mother's death, ordering new linens and furniture from catalogs, and discussing improvements to the gardens come spring. Xavier, for his part, seemed to walk with a new lightness in his step. The ranch hands remarked among themselves that the boss smiled more in those months than he had in years. He included Vivian in discussions about the ranch's operations, valuing her practical suggestions and fresh perspective. Their evenings in the library continued, but now they sat side by side on the small sofa, often with Xavier's arm around Vivian's shoulders as they read or talked. These quiet moments of intimacy, along with stolen kisses in the kitchen or lingering touches as they passed in hallways, only deepened their connection and anticipation for their married life to begin. As winter gave way to spring and the wedding day approached, guests began arriving from near and far. Neighboring ranchers, townspeople from nearby settlements, and even a few of Xavier's college friends made the journey to Prescott Ranch for the celebration. The most surprising arrival, however, came just 2 days before the wedding. Vivian was in the garden, planting early spring flowers with Mrs. Abernathy, when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Looking up, she was stunned to see Henry Thompson, the trading post owner, climbing down from the driver's seat. "Miss Blakely," he called, removing his hat, "or should I say the future Mrs. Prescott?" "Mr. Thompson," Vivian exclaimed, hurrying to greet him. "What a wonderful surprise." The older man smiled, lines crinkling around his eyes. "Couldn't miss the wedding of the year, could I? Not when I had a hand in bringing the happy couple together." Vivian laughed, genuinely delighted to see the man who had witnessed the beginning of her journey with Xavier. You must be exhausted after such a long trip. Come inside, please. Xavier will be so pleased to see you." As they walked toward the house, Henry glanced around appreciatively at the ranch. "Prescott's done well for himself," he commented. "And you seem to have found your place here, Miss Blakely." "I have," Vivian agreed, her heart full. "More than I ever could have imagined when you let me stay that night at the trading post." "Funny how things work out," Henry mused. "When those Warrens left you behind, I thought it was a cruel thing to do. Now I'm thinking they did you a favor." "The greatest favor of my life," Vivian admitted with a smile. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed designed for new beginnings. The ceremony was to be held in the garden, where early wildflowers had begun to bloom and the trees were budding with new life. In Vivian's room, Rose helped her dress in the wedding gown they had worked on together throughout the winter, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim that Rose had ordered specially from Denver. Vivian's hair was arranged in an elegant updo, with small white flowers woven throughout the chestnut strands. "You look beautiful," Rose said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "My brother is a fortunate man." Vivian smiled, her happiness too great for words. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Abernathy, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Oh, my dear girl," the housekeeper exclaimed. "You're a vision!" "Thank you both for everything," Vivian said, embracing each woman in turn. "I couldn't have asked for a more welcoming family." Another knock announced Henry Thompson, who had agreed to give Vivian away in the absence of her own father. "It's time, Miss Blakely," he said. "Everyone's waiting, and that groom of yours looks about ready to come searching for you himself." With a deep breath, Vivian took Henry's offered arm and descended the stairs. The garden had been transformed with ribbons and flowers, and chairs had been arranged in rows facing an arch covered in spring blooms. A small crowd of guests stood as Vivian appeared, but she had eyes only for Xavier. He waited beneath the arch, dressed in his finest suit, his expression one of awe as he watched her approach. Beside him stood Eli as his best man, beaming with pride for the young man he had helped raise. As Henry placed Vivian's hand in Xavier's, he whispered, "You've done right by her, Prescott." Xavier nodded solemnly before turning his attention fully to his bride. "You're breathtaking," he murmured for her ears alone. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with the local minister leading them through their vows. When Xavier promised to love, honor, and cherish Vivian for all the days of his life, his voice rang with conviction that brought tears to her eyes. And when Vivian pledged herself to him in return, she did so with absolute certainty that she had found her true home and her true love. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Xavier needed no further encouragement. He gathered Vivian into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness and passion that left no doubt of his feelings. The assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating the union of two people who had found each other through a twist of fate neither could have foreseen. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Xavier and Vivian moved among their friends and neighbors, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but always finding their way back to each other's side. As the evening grew late, Xavier led Vivian away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the stream that ran through the property. The moonlight silvered the water as it flowed gently past, and the distant sounds of music and laughter created a perfect backdrop for the moment. "Happy, Mrs. Prescott?" Xavier asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they gazed at the water. "More than I ever thought possible," Vivian replied, leaning back against his chest. "And you, Mr. Prescott?" "I have everything I could ever want right here," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "When I rode up to that trading post and saw you standing there, I had no idea I was meeting my future wife. I just knew I couldn't leave you behind." Vivian turned in his arms to face him. "You promised to take me home where I belonged," she reminded him softly. And you kept that promise, even though neither of us knew then that this would become my home, or that I would belong with you." Xavier cupped her face gently in his hands. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that you belong here, with me." "I never will," Vivian assured him, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Because you're my home now, Xavier Prescott. Wherever you are is where I belong." Under the vast Wyoming sky, with the music of their wedding celebration floating on the night air, Xavier and Vivian sealed their promise to one another with a kiss that spoke of all the days and years to come, days of hard work and simple pleasures, of challenges faced together, of a love that had begun with an act of kindness at a lonely trading post and would continue to grow and deepen throughout their lives. 5 years later, Vivian stood on the porch of Prescott Ranch, watching as Xavier taught their 4-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth played at her feet, carefully arranging pebbles in patterns only she understood. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Xavier's progressive ranching methods and Vivian's shrewd business sense had expanded their operations, adding sheep and more crops to diversify their income. The main house had grown as well, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family and the frequent visits from Rose and her children. Mrs. Abernathy still ruled the kitchen, though she had finally consented to additional help as the household expanded. She doted on the Prescott children as if they were her own grandchildren, teaching Thomas to bake cookies and telling Elizabeth stories of the early days on the ranch. Life wasn't always easy. The frontier still presented challenges in the form of harsh winters, occasional drought, and the constant work required to maintain a successful ranch. But Vivian and Xavier faced each challenge together, their partnership stronger for the difficulties they overcame. As she watched her husband lift their laughing son from the pony's back and swing him high in the air, Vivian felt a wave of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had left her stranded at Stillwater Trading Post 5 years earlier. What had seemed like abandonment and betrayal had actually been the first step on a journey to true happiness. Xavier looked up and caught her watching. With Thomas perched on his shoulders, he walked toward the porch, his smile as warm and sincere as the day they met. "What are you thinking about? Looking so serious over here?" he asked, setting Thomas down to run to his sister. "Just how fortunate I am," Vivian replied, reaching for his hand. "How one moment of seeming misfortune changed everything for the better." Xavier squeezed her hand, understanding immediately what she meant. "The best decision I ever made was telling you I'd take you home where you belong," he said, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "And the best decision I ever made was believing you," Vivian replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. As their children played at their feet and the Wyoming sun shone down on the home they had built together, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that she had indeed found where she belonged, not just a place on a map, but a place in the heart of the man who had rescued her in more ways than one, and who continued to show her every day what it meant to be truly home.